In a previous video, I walked you through the basics of an auction draft. In this video, I've actually done an entire draft, and rather than walk you through the basics, I will be giving you tips on how to be successful at an auction draft. Make sure you've prepped for the draft, and by prepped I mean you've gotten your cheat sheet, you know who you want, and you're ready. For this particular draft, I will be employing a strategy that seeks to maximize the number of top 15 players I acquire, and towards the end, shift towards a value-based draft approach. And by top 15 players, I mean if you look at the average draft positions, these would be some of the top 15 players that would go in a snake draft. The reason auction is such a good way to draft is that it gives everyone the ability to target any player on the board. Imagine if you were doing a snake draft and you had 10th pick. By the time it was your turn to pick, you would have no chance at Antonio Brown. However, in auction, everyone has a chance at Antonio Brown. The first tip I have for you is to know your league. A quarterback in a 10-player league that only starts one QB will not go for as much as a quarterback in a league that's 12 players and starts 2 quarterbacks. Scarcity is important. If you know how many players at certain positions are being started, you have a heads up in knowing which players are going to demand more money. And as the auction goes on, if you pay attention to these numbers, similarly, you'll know which players will command a bigger premium. The second tip I have for you is to know who you want and how much you want to spend. And that's where the cheat sheet comes into play. If you have a cheat sheet, half the work's already done for you. The other half of the work is just identifying who you want. Now, the reason this is important is that during the draft, you want to make other players spend their money. And you do this by nominating players you don't want to bid on, and by bidding on players you don't want so that other people pay more money for them. And if you know how much you want to spend, you'll keep yourself from overspending or spending too much on someone who's not worth it. And you'll also be able to identify good values later on. The third tip I have for you is to pay for your studs. Studs are top players that usually go early in snake drafts. These players command a premium because they've either proven to be consistent or they have a really good situation. For instance, a team that has a prolific offense, or whatever the reason is, these players are highly valued. And like I said earlier, in an auction draft, you have the ability to get anyone you want. So for this particular auction draft, I was able to get Des Bryant, Julio Jones, and Todd Gurley. And these players are among the top 15 players based on their average draft position. And that's unheard of in a snake draft. You know, regardless of where you're drafting in the snake, it's very, very unlikely that you could end up with these 3 players. Now, this particular auction turned out to be good because there's a good mix of strategies going on. While I decided to pay for some studs and spend a large chunk of my budget, a few other participants did too, but there are other players who did not spend their money on any studs. In fact, this guy at the very bottom, Will, that second Will, he didn't really spend any of his money until the end, after all the studs were off the board. And that's a strategy, but in my opinion, you can be left with a lot of money in your bank if you take that strategy. And all the picks that you spend your money on don't have that proven consistency that studs do. The next tip that I have for you is to nominate players who you don't want and you want other people to spend their money on. That's a legit strategy. You don't have to nominate based on the order that Yahoo puts players on there. You can nominate anyone that you want, and I suggest that you nominate players that are good and that may command a good premium. You want to encourage other people to spend their money. The next tip I have for you is to adapt to what's going on. While I did have a sense of what I wanted to do when I came into this auction draft, had things played differently, I would have been ready to adapt. Meaning, if the top 15 players were going for far more than what was actually bid on here, and I didn't want to pay that much, I would have adapted. And at the end, I would have had much more money to bid on players, ranked 15 through 50, and had a team of not necessarily studs, but players with a lot of upside and consistency. The next tip I have for you is to save some money for the end game. What happens in auction drafts is that there's only so much money to go around, and at the end it turns into this snake-like draft where everyone only has $1 that they can spend per player. And so it turns into like the snake draft, where the player that you nominate is the player that you get. However, if you're smart and you save just a little bit of money, and this requires some patience because you'll have to pass up a deal or two, but if you save this money, you can outbid other players by just $1 in this endgame state. And you do tend to find a lot of deals towards the end, because like I said, there's only so much money to go around. And this is where you can really add depth to your team. A lot of players are often overlooked. People pay more attention to the studs, and some of these players with a lot of upside, who in a regular draft would go, between rounds 8 and 14, you can have your pick at. So in this particular draft, that's what I did. I was patient and I waited towards the end, and I filled my team up with a bunch of these budget players, who in my opinion aren't really budget players, but players who got overlooked, and I was able to have my go at whomever I wanted because I was able to outbid the other player by just $1. Another tip I have for you is to keep track of who's being drafted. While this Yahoo interface is nice and it has a lot of features, it's not really good for glancing at and identifying good deals. What I recommend is that you either have an electronic version of your cheat sheet or a printout of your cheat sheet where you cross out players who have already been drafted. What ends up happening is, towards the end of the auction, you'll notice some players that haven't been crossed out and are higher up on your list. And what you want to do is not nominate these players, but keep on waiting and try to snag these players at the end for a low price. And if you have your printed out cheat sheet and you're crossing players out as you do it, it's very easy to see these players at a glance and not get distracted by all the bells and whistles that you see here. This next tip is more for when you prep for your draft. In the hours before the draft, before you head to wherever it is you're conducting your draft, or before it ever occurs, you want to spend 10 to 20 minutes doing some quick research on your favorite fantasy football blog on reddit.com/rfantasyfootball, on Twitter, wherever, to be up to date on the latest news. You want to know if there are any injuries for that day or any injuries from the previous night's preseason games, just so that you don't overpay for someone who's been injured. Information is key here, and nowadays it's really easy to find the latest news, and it's important that you do. I recall in years past, some of my league mates drafted players like Jordy Nelson and Kelvin Benjamin without knowing that they were injured, and they paid a premium price for them, which in the end came back to hurt them. Another quick tip is don't pay that much attention to bye weeks. You'll deal with bye weeks when they come. You'll either make trades, or you'll pick up players off the waiver, or you'll use whatever players you have on your bench. But don't give bye weeks too much consideration in your strategy. In fact, many, if not most leagues are won on the waiver wire. While a good draft is important, a lot of the teams that win leagues are very different from the teams that are actually drafted. Injuries happen, trades happen. For whatever reasons, players are moved around. And what's important during this draft, or during a draft, is that you position yourself with enough depth to make moves, to have a strong team, to deal with injuries, and to be flexible. That's the importance of the draft. This next tip is mainly for leagues where you're only starting one QB. If you're starting 2 QBs or more, then it makes a lot of sense to grab a QB early on. But if your league is only starting one QB, even if it's a 12 or maybe even a 14 team league, it kind of makes sense to wait for a QB. There are a lot of deals to be had later in the draft, and if you're nominating QBs early on, you're getting other players to spend their money on QBs while you save your money for depth and wide receivers and running backs. Another tip is don't spend more than $1 on your kicker, defense, and possibly tight end. Those positions have very few players who are really good at what they do and command a premium. And beyond those, there's really no one worth paying extra money for. So unless you're getting one of those players and not overpaying for them, like in this draft, some guy overpaid for Gronkowski. Unless you're getting those specific guys, don't pay more than $1 for your tight end, kicker, or defense. Heck, you can even take it one step further. Yahoo doesn't require you to draft every single position, meaning you don't have to get a kicker and you don't have to get a defense. The only requirement with Yahoo is that you draft 15 out of 15 players. So in my case, I went ahead and drafted extra wide receivers and extra running backs to make sure that I had enough depth to make my decisions as the season comes to a start. So when it's finally time to make my team and put my roster, then I'll decide if I want to drop some players or package some players and trade them to somebody else. But not drafting that kicker and defense gives me a ton of extra flexibility, and it made my money go further. So as I mentioned earlier, you can see in this video where the draft turns into that $1 and $2 game, and you can see that I'm finding a lot of deals. I really spent all my money on 2 wide receivers and 1 running back, so now I'm spending my money to add depth. I'm getting more running backs, players who are starting for other teams. Between Arian Foster and Jay Ajayi, for example, I'm getting a whole another starting running back. Even if Foster goes down, Jay is going to take the starting role, and that's definitely worth the $3 to $6 that I'm spending on them. And there's a lot of other good players who are starter worthy on their real life teams that I'm getting great deals on and are great backups in case any of the studs that I've paid so much money for don't pan out. And like I said, even if I don't end up using these players, they also make good trade bait. And when I trade them, they may return more value than the $2 or $3 I ultimately paid for them during the auction. Now, that doesn't mean that you should draft solely on the intent to trade. In this particular case, I was drafting given my strategy. I filled out my top 3 players, and then based on those, I added depth to ensure that I wasn't stuck with just relying on those top 3 players for all of my production. One of the most important tips I have for you is to have fun. The draft is really one of the only times where all of your league mates may get together and be in this social setting where you're just having fun, making jokes, having a good time. I will recommend that you don't overdo it if you're drinking. You don't want to be making too many mistakes because your mind isn't in the right place. But do enjoy yourself. Take advantage of the situation, eat some good food. Depending on when you do it, there may be football games on TV. Make it a party, make it a fun event. It's memorable, and if you have a good start to your league, and if you have a fun draft, then the rest of the season follows through, and you tend to have fun. You tend to have an active league. And those are all the tips I have for you. I've posted the teams at the bottom, and you can look at how much each player went for and compare the teams that are final. Granted, towards the end, a lot of the players left this auction, but by that time, it was already, that $1 per player type draft, which is where I think I got the most deals. But again, be adaptive, know your settings, know who you want, and have fun.